Good afternoon, welcome. I'm Stephanie Pacheco. I direct the Education and Outreach Programming at the Hopkins Center. And I feel like every time I come up here to introduce a panel, I say, oh, we're so excited to have these artists here this week, but it's almost impossible to untangle all the ties that the Nile Project and Dartmouth and the Hopkins Center have built over the years. Some of you know this was a program and a project that's been 3 years in the making. I actually looked back at my email today, and my first emails about this were from March 2012. And in the summer of that year, we had a group of faculty join us from departments all across the campus to think about the lens we could look through this very rich program that looks at music and political issues and environmental sustainability issues in the Nile Basin. A year later, in the summer of 2013, the Nile Project co-founders, Mina Girgis, who's with us today, Maklit Hadero, and their music director, Miles J., came back for a residency that was really about planning, where we sat with faculty, we sat with community organizations like the Upper Valley Land Trust and the Monshire Museum, and we also gathered a group of arts presenters from performing arts centers across the New England region to really start to crystallize a conversation about what is this relationship between the Nile Project's music program, where they're bringing together artists and musicians from 11 countries in this unprecedented cultural exchange, and how does that tie with their educational and engagement platform that's really looking at environmental and political sustainability. And it was really fascinating to consider the impact that this group could have on Dartmouth and the Upper Valley and the New England region as a whole, where we're looking at the Connecticut River really uniting a lot of towns, a lot of states. And though the issues are very different, we are certainly thinking about similar trends of water resource management and civic engagement. So we wanted to bring together some of our faculty and some of our players from our local region with Mina today. I'm just going to introduce Chris in a moment, who will be moderating. I will say there's information at the back. The concert is really going to be quite an incredible, high-energy, fabulous affair on Friday night at 8 in Spalding. So we encourage you to come back and see. We have 12 musicians on stage, and it'll be quite the dance party. Chris Hardy-Wolfforth is an educator and academic administrator with 20 years experience in higher education. She specializes in global learning and educational opportunities and how institutions shape outcomes of both academic and political settings. At Dartmouth, she's director of the Montgomery Fellows Program. She's former associate for program development at the Dickey Center for International Understanding and adjunct faculty at the Department of Government. So I will turn it over to Chris. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. I am really delighted to join you and our distinguished panelists for what promises to be a riveting discussion of rivers. Corny joke aside now, I've relieved our panelists from having to make them. I want to state that we have 4 really terrific people representing very different perspectives around water resource management, and that this panel represents the height of the liberal arts approach to understanding and looking at issues, and that we have a diversity of perspectives represented here. We have a physical geographer, we have a human geographer, we have an environmental scientist who works for a nonprofit, and we have an ethnomusicologist. It's a very, very diverse group, and very exciting to see how they're all going to come together. Over the course of a short hour, we're going to travel from the Connecticut River Valley just outside our door to the Nile River, stopping in China and elsewhere on our way in an exploration of the challenges of river resource management and civic engagement. We've asked each of the panelists to speak for about 10 minutes, framing for us how they look at the challenge of river management. We will then give them the opportunity to query each other in a brief question and answer session here at the panel table before we open up the discussion to you, our audience. I'm going to introduce all of the panels up front now before they then come up one in succession, so we don't need to interrupt the flow of their presentations with the intros. Starting off, our discussion is Andrew Fisk, the Executive Director of the Connecticut River Watershed Council. The Connecticut River Watershed Council works to restore and protect the Connecticut River as it flows through New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. Some of the many activities of the council include removing defunct dams and restoring habitat for fish, creating better hydropower solutions on the river, organizing trash cleanup, and regular testing and monitoring of water quality. And he brings to the council extensive experience working with municipalities, industry, and citizens to develop, finance, and implement clean water requirements to eliminate things like algae blooms, sewer overflows, and to maintain stream and river flows. He has also been actively involved in implementing science-based protections for thousands of acres of wildlife habitat. And he has a PhD in environmental sciences and a master's in city and regional planning from Rutgers University. He has served as president of the Association of State and Interstate Water Pollution Control Agencies and as chair of the New England Interstate Water Pollution Control Commission, where he initiated the country's first regional mercury cleanup plan for the Northeast states, a program aimed in part at making the region's fish safe to eat. In our panel today, Dr. Fisk offers us the perspective of a nonprofit player seeking to engage the public around water quality issues. Next up, we welcome Frank McGilligan, the Frank J. Regan 09 Chair of Policy Studies and Professor of Geography here at Dartmouth. Professor McGilligan is a graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he earned master's and PhD degrees in geography, as well as a master's in water resources management. In addition to teaching in the geography department, he holds an adjunct position in earth sciences. Frank is a fluvial geomorphologist and surface water hydrologist, which is a fancy way of saying he studies water, its movement, quality, impact on the land through which it flows. His particular research is focused on stream channel and watershed response to environmental change, whether that change is a result of natural forces such as climate change, hurricanes, or man-made forces like agriculture, logging, and the like. He has worked on landscape impacts of catastrophic floods in the upper Mississippi River and glacial outburst floods in Iceland, on El Niño effects in Peru, and closer to home, the impact of 2011's Hurricane Irene in Vermont. Most of his recent research has focused on hydroecologic effects of dams, and we will hear from Frank about the impacts of dams on rivers today. Our third panelist, Colleen Fox, is a senior lecturer in geography, and she also works on dams, though unlike Frank, she focuses specifically on the human impacts from them. Professor Fox's research investigates the social and political dimensions of environmental alteration, particularly in transboundary river basins subject to multiple political and social regimes. Much of her research has focused on the Mekong River basin in Southeast Asia, and she has research projects on the social and political consequences of dam removal in New England and a project on indigenous peoples and river restoration in the US, Canada, and New Zealand. Professor Fox holds a PhD in geography from the University of Oregon and teaches classes on international development, conservation and development, and global health, courses featured in the geography, environmental studies, and international studies programs here at Dartmouth. Our final panelist comes at river issues from an entirely different background. Mina Gerges is the president and CEO of the Nile Project, an organization seeking to mitigate conflict over water resources among the 11 nations bordering the Nile. By addressing the cultural and environmental challenges at the core of the conflict, the Nile Project aims to cultivate a culture of cooperation and sustainability of their ecosystem. It does so through programs in music, education, dialogue, leadership, and innovation to engage students across disciplines and across geographies. An ethnomusicologist with background in hospitality experience design, Mina explores new ways to cultivate environments conducive to learning, making, and experiencing music. He specializes in curating and producing innovative musical collaborations across diverse styles. Mina earned his bachelor's degree in hospitality administration from Florida State University and his master's in ethnomusicology from the University of California, Santa Barbara. He is a Synergos Pioneers of Egypt Fellow, a Wired 2014 Innovation Fellow, and a National Arts Strategies Creative Community Fellow. Mina will address in particular the role of cultural diplomacy in river resource management. So that's our panel. Let's get started, and please join me in welcoming our first panelist, Andy Fisk.
And how do I get the presentation to start? There we go. This is very small. Where's the?
Can you click on the lower corner here, just down here, and that'll go into full screen right there? Should, yeah. Is that not working?
You have to just look at that screen.
Can you get it to do slides?
We have a new technical
Thank you.
system in this room, so we're still with it. There you go.
Great, thank you. I think it's important to first note that our two watersheds, the Nile watershed as well as the Connecticut watershed, have many similarities. They are both extreme sources of energy and sustenance for our two watersheds, quite obviously. They are both international. There are many countries in the Nile watershed. There are many countries in the Connecticut River watershed, Vermont, New Hampshire. The watersheds are also different, obviously. They have many differences in terms of the politics, the culture, the geography as well. And of course, you have crocodiles and we do not. I think the other thing to note being up here at Dartmouth is your most famous dropout, John Ledyard, binds our two watersheds by bones. John Ledyard, after he dropped out of Dartmouth, paddled down the Connecticut River and traveled around the world, ended up dying in Egypt, and his unmarked grave is along the banks of the Nile River. So there is some long-term synergies here. So my conversation today is going to talk about the power of water and the power of words. So the Watershed Council is interested in engaging the public in the work that we do. And we are interested in engaging the public in meaningful ways. And so I'm here to talk about an example of civic engagement around the issue of hydropower and energy, and frankly, a generational conversation about the Connecticut River. There we go. So what is the opportunity? So you can see here the map of our watershed. We have a generational opportunity in that there are 5 hydropower facilities, 4 dams, and 1 pumped storage project that generate 30% of New England's hydropower that are currently being relicensed by the federal and state government all at once. That never happens. Usually you have dams that are brought up for relicensing one at a time, and they are out of sequence in terms of where they sit in the watershed. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has said we will take these 5 facilities, which amounts to 175 to 200 miles of river, and we will have a conversation about the future of these facilities and our river together, which provides an unprecedented opportunity to think about flow, connections, cumulative impact, and the relationship between these facilities. We're going to talk a little bit more about some of the impacts of hydropower. I want to give you an example about one impact of hydropower facilities that will inform the conversation that we are having that we call the power of water and the power of words. And so the Connecticut River obviously supports many diadromous fish species. Those are those fish that need to move up and down the river and use both the estuary and the ocean to complete their life cycle. And so there are many of these species of fish whose job is to move up and down the river. However, with the number of dams and obstructions that we have put in our river system, frankly, for them to get back and forth to their job is difficult, if not impossible. And so you can obviously understand that a dam is going to create an impediment to fish passage. So let me give you an example. If we're thinking about the American shad, the American shad is an iconic fish. It is also a fish of great sustenance for people as well as other critters within the ocean. It is an important keystone species. If we go down to Holyoke, Massachusetts, you're looking at a schematic of the Connecticut River. The American shad will return from the ocean every year. They are beginning to get ready to come up the river. The first dam on the Connecticut River is at Holyoke, Massachusetts. And what I want to explore with you is what are our current expectations for fish being able to pass through and by these man-made obstructions. So in the last 2 years, on average, we've had about 380,000 American shad that have made it to Holyoke, Massachusetts. That is far less than the 600,000 we might have seen in prior years. So the population is under pressure, and not as many of these fish are coming home to spawn and breed as have in the past. We have a current expectation that half of the fish that reach any one dam will pass. And then again, another half of those fish, when they reach the next dam, will pass. And so if we imagine 80 fish passing at Holyoke, Massachusetts, those 80 fish will then migrate up to Turner's Falls, Massachusetts, and our expectation, our goal, our aspiration is half of those again will pass, and then they will migrate up to Vernon, and half again of those fish will pass. That is our goal. I call this a goal of meh. It is not very inspiring, frankly, because if you imagine cutting your population in half all the way along you go, you are going to have an impact on the population of those fish. They need stretches of river in order to spawn. You can imagine you need to have your own little space in order to have your family. If you're too crowded, habitat is not sufficient to breed and spawn. What actually happens? Let's take those 80 fish again. When they make it to Turner's Falls, 10% make it past Turner's Falls. When they get to Vernon, 50% pass, but 50% of 8? 4 to 5. This is what is actually happening in our rivers now. I call this bleh. So we have started with meh, and we actually now are at bleh. And we are significantly impacting the ability of the American shad populations to grow and thrive. So what is the challenge here? The challenge for federal licensing of dams is frankly difficult, long, complex, and arduous. This is an example, frankly, if you were to take all the studies around these 5 facilities and stack them up, you would see linear feet or many, many megabytes worth of studies that have to be examined by a distant bureaucracy that is based in Washington, that comes into the watershed several times a year for meetings and is engaging with the 2 owners of these 5 facilities and those members of the environmental community or the public that can afford to spend time working on this issue. I have 2 staff that I pay half-time to work on just this one issue. So obviously you need to really be able to put time into this study, this issue, in order to understand what are 69 ongoing studies about these 5 facilities. This is a daunting process even for those of us that are professionals. We perceive our work and the river in terms of complexity, data, and technical frames of mind, because that's our job in order to evaluate these 69 studies and all the many impacts of a hydropower project. However, the public does not. The public perceives their river from a visceral and an emotional frame. They don't think technically, they don't think complexity, they don't think about data. They don't come up and ask about whether the MCL for perchlorate in the state's water quality criteria is sufficient. They say, is my river healthy? So our quest for civic engagement in a long, complicated, politically difficult process that spans 5 years, 5 facilities, and 200 miles is to figure out the right question. What question do we ask the public? And so we have now lit upon this question, and we think that this is evocative and will engage the public. What do you want for your river? This question has a lot of meaning inside of it because of the statutes that govern this process. There are 3 statutes that we are principally working with: the Clean Water Act, the Federal Power Act, and the Endangered Species Act. If we think about the Clean Water Act, there are some very important attributes of that act that we seek to remind the public, and I'm sure all of you know this. Who owns the water? Who owns the fish? And who has legal responsibility for stewardship of the same? The answer is the public. And when you say to the public, you own the water and you own the fish, and then you ask this question, we think we will get important responses that we can then take to the public decision makers and say to them, ordinarily when you're doing dam relicensing, you don't hear from a lot of the public, but we are seeking to bring 1,000 river stories to these deciders in a format and in a way that we think is interesting for the public and also inspirational, monumental, and persuasive. So what does that look like? We are working with Art for Water. Art for Water, Christine Detrompe is an artist in Harrisville, New Hampshire, and she has come upon a model of saying, if you have people write their stories on pieces of heavy coverweight paper And you collect those stories and you build an art exhibition for them and you display people's stories. You collect them in a meaningful way and you display those stories in an exhibition. You can empower people and let them know they are able to communicate. So we are trying an example of traveling around the watershed and telling stories about the river and the issues that are related to hydropower relicensing and collecting 1,000 river stories. And over the course of the next 18 months, we will then have exhibitions that ideally will have stories that talk to the state 401 water quality certificate writer, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and those people that are going to write the license that will exist for the next 30 years for these 5 hydropower facilities. And so we think this is analogous to what the Nile Project is trying to do, because when you come at an issue from your heart, your gut, or your beliefs, that can be powerful, and it can be as powerful as data and studies and, frankly, other types of political suasion. Great.
Thank you.
Get to me. Click on the laptop. I can't. I'll leave it to you. You can just put me on. I think it's called mild.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find the mouse. It's not
The one right above the folder that says presentations. There you go.
Oh, there it is.
Next one, keep going down, and that's me. Great, thanks so much. And I guess I'd just like to augment and complement much of what Andrew was just sort of talking about, but also to fold in, again, also what he started off with, this idea that what the similarities are not between the Connecticut River Basin and also the Nile River Basin. So again, one of the things just to sort of start off with in terms of sort of water management and the ways we sort of manage at the watershed scale, which oftentimes is very different than managing at the sort of the nation-state scale. There are lots of political, social, and cultural dimensions that are associated with this. So I'd just like to start off just for you to just reflect for a second and just think about, when you think of the Nile, what country immediately comes to mind? Egypt. Okay, Egypt did it. Okay. So when we look though at the Nile is an especially large river basin, spanning 11 countries, as we've just heard about. And so it's not just restricted to Egypt. And again, in terms of trying to manage this, there's a whole suite and set of stakeholders and actors involved here. And much of what Minna was talking about in our classes today was really trying to best articulate that level of river basin coordination. Now, the other thing that also makes it sort of really interesting from a fluvial geomorphic perspective, if I could wear that hat for a second, is that also when we think about the flow of the Nile, and again, here it is, the river sort of in this case flowing to the north, ultimately into the Mediterranean, then you think about in terms of the hydropower relationships, and here in terms of the sets of power relationships between these states over the watershed, much of what Colleen will talk about in a second. The Nile is quite unusual. We think about what percent of the total flow of a river is drained within that watershed. The Nile is the most unusual. In fact, 97% of the flow of the Nile originates outside of Egypt. Okay, so oftentimes we have this disconnect, perhaps a hydrologic or political disconnect between where the water is coming from and where the country that we associate most with this basin. And so again, it's perhaps the most at the end member of this. But also from a political geography perspective as well, is that more often than not, We often think of it as the country that has the most sort of power, if you will, in terms of this political power, is oftentimes the more upstream riparian nations. And again, for the Nile, one of the things that we see is that the dominant nation then in terms of the political power over the past century plus has been Egypt, even though most of the water originates outside of the basin. So it's a very sort of complicated set of river basin coordination that needs ultimately to emerge. And again, we sort of think of this hydrologically, also need to think about it perhaps climatologically. So here, just sort of looking at the temperature for Ethiopia, but also then sort of looking at it in terms of precipitation, we see that there's a real sort of concentration of precipitation primarily within the summer months within this basin. So climatologically, without getting too lost in the physical geography of this, but really one of the rain producers that we see here is what's going on with what's known as the Intertropical Convergence Zone. And that ITCZ is a climatic system that shifts with the relative position of the sun through the course of the year. So in terms of the rain bringer, then really what we sort of need to see then in terms of the rainfall-dominated hydrology of the upper part of the Nile Basin is very much controlled by the relative position and the strengths of this climatic system. So one of the things that people worry about, of course, are things like climate change and what's going to happen then with the relative position and strength. And this is what drives the bus then in terms of precipitation for the headwaters of the Nile Basin. But also one of the things that we see from the sort of large-scale climatologic connections is that the river flow within the Nile is also highly related to El Nino events. And so oftentimes during El Nino periods, which is an event that's anchored off the eastern Pacific that's associated with drought-producing conditions within the upper Nile Basin. So there's a lot of climatological signals here that we have to sort of pay attention to because these climatological signals, of course, are going to map onto the hydrology of the river basin. So what I'm just showing here is what's known as just simply a hydrograph. This is discharge on the y-axis, and on the x-axis here is time through the course of the year, going from January to December. And again, certainly what we see is that for the Blue Nile in particular, the eastern part of the headwaters in the Ethiopian highlands, that again, this is mapping onto the precipitation regime ultimately that we see. So how would you describe then the relative difference in stream flow between the two major tributaries of the Nile, the White Nile and the Blue Nile river basin? And actually, I'm going to go back a couple of slides just to sort of point these out on the map. This is the White Nile Basin, and here's the Blue Nile Basin coming off primarily from the eastern flank there. So again, we have to think about this perhaps in terms of volume of flow, but also the timing of flows as well. So the real stream flow producer, of course, is going to be the Blue Nile, right? And the White Nile is less of that. But what does the White Nile have that the Blue Nile does not have? Okay, that variability, okay? So how do you make variable flow more reliable from a management perspective? If you are trying to modulate this through the course of the year, and here we have the Blue Nile concentrating its flow, and from a management or, again, from irrigation perspective, you want to have that water available through the course of the year. You build a dam, okay? And so one of the things that we see is that the construction here of the Aswan High Dam, which is going to be then sort of regulating that flow. And again, it's downstream of the Blue Nile and White Nile confluence. So we see here, this also has been a big part of the coordination or lack of coordination in many ways of these different riparian nations dealing with management ultimately of the Nile Basin. Okay, so this has been a big part of the development of the Nile. Again, the High Dam gets built in the late 50s, very political, Cold War dimensions to this as well. You'll have to take my water policy class or Colleen's class to sort of deal with this as well. But this gets built in the late 50s, early 60s, Lake Nasser here, and just a little bit coming across the border there. And so this is a relatively large structure that regulates the flow of one of the world's more iconic, but also one of the largest rivers in the globe. And we see this as a part of a sort of a major period of dam construction globally. And again, Colleen will be talking much more about this. We see this is some data from the International Commission on Large Dams. We see there's a real boom in large dam construction in the 1950s, up in certainly globally up through the 1970s as well. So this is a big part of a lot of U.S. aid, but also large part of the Cold War. Large dams were very instrumental within this. Also, some of the things we talked about today in class, also dams being some expression of modernization. So the dams fold in quite well across the globe, especially within this time period. In the United States, how many dams are there in the United States? Tim, how much? I hear 70,000. I hear 20,000. 20 or 20,000? 20,000. Okay, it's about 80,000 dams, and these are just the dams that make it into the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers National Inventory of Dams. Okay, and many think there are millions more, hundreds of thousands, if not more, scattered across the United States. Why do I have this up here? One way that I always like to think about this, that essentially, as a nation, we have been building, on average, one large dam per day since the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Okay, there's the busy beavers, I guess, out there across the national landscape building all of these dams. So the United States also has been a large part of this sort of global burst of dam construction. Ours was a little bit earlier. Most of the large dams within the United States were very much a function of Teddy Roosevelt, the Bureau of Reclamation, also his second cousin, third time remove FDR in terms of the TVA dams. But we also had a real burst of large dam construction from the 40s up through the mid-60s, and it really stops around the early 1970s. What might explain that decline in large dam construction? Environmental activism, anchored by legislation, what Andrew was just talking about, especially Endangered Species Act, Clean Water Act. But also, one of the things we also see is that most of the best sites were already taken, and it was also going to be more prohibitive, cost prohibitive as well. Right? So it's a confluence of all these political, environmental, and other economic factors as well. So again, we see sort of a series of large dams are built, certainly in the 1930s during the New Deal. Again, these are a big part of the Bureau of Reclamation, so institutionally, this is a big part of it, but not just to be restricted out to the western United States. We also see lots of large dams built throughout the southeastern United States as part of the Electrifying the South FDR TVA program as well. So there are lots of these large dams in the United States, 1930s, but really sort of petering out by the early part of the 1970s. So we put on a sort of that scientific hat now, as opposed to just thinking about in terms of the political dimensions. The way we sort of think about the impacts of dams in many ways can be broken down. I guess my work on my spelling a little, my outlining a little bit, about what do dams do? And again, what is this concern that we have for large dams, or even in some instances, I'll show some slides, even some small low-head dams might also have some significant ecological impact. So one of the things that ecologists talk about is this concept of fragmentation. In other words, you're breaking up that longitudinal pattern. Again, Andrew was just sort of talking about that as well. And this might be some expression we also might think of in terms of connectivity. And so that longitudinal connectivity going from either the estuarine environment up to the headwaters for lots of these diadromous fish like salmon or lamprey or shad or the like. Or one of the ones I'll talk about in a second as well is lateral connectivity, which is a big part that plays into the Nile as well, the impacts of the high Aswan Dam. But also sort of lastly, a little bit less today, talk about some of these issues of habitat loss as well. So if you put a series of reservoirs in fact, one of the things we see is that we are fragmenting these watersheds. And so one of the ways we are fragmenting them is that we are disruptive that normative downstream flux of matter and energy, right? So basically, sediment and nutrients and other sort of geochemical components are no longer being able to make it down to the mouth of the river system. And all of this material is stored behind this reservoir. There's some leakage, depending upon the size of the dam and the way it was constructed. But also, we're blocking upstream fluxes. In this case, we're blocking upstream fluxes of fish, right? Diagenous fish, right? And so we're fragmenting this longitudinal connectivity by putting these dams in. But we're also affecting the lateral connectivity as well. This is a shot of the Mississippi River here. This is the Mississippi River. This is the Mississippi River floodplain during the flood of 1993. And I guess we could say in this photo, this house is now highly connected to the Mississippi River, right? In terms of its flooding, and I think that's sort of grandma up there on the roof there, right? And so, again, so this is a natural process. Rivers flood. It's a natural process. So in terms of this lateral connectivity, one of the things that we're interested in is that flux of material from the stream channel out across its floodplain. Okay, and in particular, that's going to be nutrients. Sediment is basically, those nutrients are absorbed onto the sediment. That water comes out of the sediment, comes out of the water column, gets distributed from the river channel out across that floodplain, and providing the sort of silts, in this case, especially in the Nile, those organic rich silts, which were fundamental as sort of a natural fertilizer that has now been abated by this high Aswan Dam. Some other work, and this is some work in some dryland environments. One of the things that we see, some recent work, is that we oftentimes just think of it as a one-way street here, as water and sediment coming from the channels out across the floodplain. But in a lot of dryland environments, one of the things we see is a lot of organic carbon that basically gets its way from the floodplain back into the stream channel. And that flux is equally critical from a geochemical perspective, that it's not just from the channel to the floodplain, but there's a lot of organics that are also coming from the floodplain back into the channel, and that becomes an important budget that needs to be, that loop needs to be tied down, okay? So one of the things we see then in terms of the high Aswan Dam is that in terms of providing the flood control that was critical, evening out that flow through the course of the year, better for irrigation, then one of the things that's happened now, you've stopped that flux of nutrient-rich sediment making it out across the floodplain. And one of the things that we see is there's been an intensification of fertilizer use in Egypt. And oftentimes this fertilizer is petroleum-based, so it has a very large carbon footprint. So we think about the ecological impacts of dams. There's a huge debate in the literature between clean versus green hydropower. It might be clean and renewable source of energy, but there's lots of work that's showing that it might not necessarily be green because of either the direct or indirect impacts on carbon footprints and greenhouse gas emissions behind some of these reservoirs. So it's sort of a trade-off, but I think now we're getting a better sense of what those budgets are within those trade-offs. So we bring it out to the Connecticut River Basin. And again, one of the things I was really struck by today with Minna's talk is just the idea of sort of institutional capacity. It was a big part of what his lecture to our students was about today. So when we think about then this sort of institutional capacity, just as Andrew said, we have, and it is an international basin. In fact, the Connecticut River, probably like 0.001% of the total drainage area originates in Canada, but that's enough to fall under the rubric of being an international basin, which of course is going to require some international coordination, the sets of actors that are involved ultimately within that as well. There's a whole host of agencies and institutions that are involved with this, and again, it's Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, Connecticut. Waterfalls is a strange resource. Oftentimes it falls under federal legislation, oftentimes it falls under state legislation, and so how that mix gets operationalized there's a whole course on that, Geography 14. You can learn all about it, okay? Right? So we have lots of actors and stakeholders here, certainly from a federal level. We have the Corps of Engineers and NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. How does NOAA get involved in Connecticut River management? And what agency is NOAA under, by the way? On the... What's that? Yeah. No, I'm asking you. Yeah, what? Interior? It's under Commerce. Okay. So here we got a NOAA Commerce here. And how does it get involved with the Connecticut River? endangered species, okay? Because diadromous fish, they go out, a big part of their life is out in the marine environment. Noaa is a big player in this, especially for things like dam removal. They're one of the major actors for this. And you can't, of course, we have lots of other actors involved as well, nonprofits, NGOs. Again, we have the Connecticut River Joint Commission. And again, one of the problems, again, what Minna was talking about today is having that power. What is that institutional power? And how does that get mediated over time? And who gets brought to the table? Sometimes it's just the first step in that coordination, who has this asymmetry in terms of those power relationships, but also who gets to be there as well. So we have the Connecticut River Watershed Council, we have the Connecticut River Joint Commission, we have a lot of NGOs that are also involved with this, the Nature Conservancy, the American Rivers. It takes a village, okay, to coordinate and manage a watershed, even at the scale of the Connecticut, not even dealing with 11 different countries, just dealing with the states ultimately of New England. We also have a rich history here within New England. This is a series of, again, we talk about a landscape. This is very much a dammed landscape, what Andrew was sort of talking about. And a lot of this is for the sort of the rich industrial history for New England. Dams were a big part of that rich industrial history, but a lot of these are becoming obsolete. And again, one of the things that Andrew's group and other groups, American Rivers, is that there's a big push right now to remove a lot of these, what are known as orphaned or derelict dams. And New Hampshire has, and in particular New England has a boatload of these derelict dams. So we have lots of dams in New England, okay? We have lots of hydropower dams. That's certainly what Andrew was just sort of talking about, that sort of dot the landscape. We also have a lot of flood control dams. And in particular, again, in terms of this river basin management, I don't know if anyone here is from Vermont or not, but the dams along Union Village in Vermont, dams on the West River in southern Vermont, the dams along the Ottaquechee, what were they built for? Flood control. And who are they trying to protect in Union Village Dam? Union Village? Would you spend $7 million to protect 11 people in Union Village? Right, so these dams were built to protect Springfield, Mass. And Hartford, Connecticut. Okay, and so again, how these basins are linked, and so basically, again, this idea that we suffer in many ways, the ecological repercussions are local, but the benefits are accrued perhaps someplace else. And again, these are some of the things we have to concern ourselves with. But also for New England, we have lots of these run-of-the-river dams, and again, for some fish like salmon, they might be able to negotiate something like this, but other fish, like resident fish like trout, the upstream section might as well be on the moon because they can't access that. And there are a boatload of these run-of-the-river facilities. So, 80,000 dams within the United States. The National Inventory of Dams says we have about 4,000 dams within New England. One of the things I've been doing is compiling these data from various state agencies. And in fact, it's much larger than 4,000 dams within New England. Just sort of close your eyes for a second and think, if I were to put a dot on a map for New England and show you where every dam was in New England, what would it look like? It would look a lot. There are 14,210 dams in New England. So this is a big part, again, in trying to manage this basin. In particular, a lot of these are obsolete orphan dams, and a lot of the work that the Connecticut Andrews group is working on has been outstanding in trying to initiate this process. And for New England, about 130 dams have come out in the last 3 decades or so. So it's a lot of work with a lot of Dartmouth faculty working on this, a lot of other organizations, American Rivers, NGOs, and other Andrews groups and the like. So just sort of leave you with this, that in fact, in terms of the differences, there are some spectacular differences, but one of the things we see then in terms of trying to manage it, whether at the scale of the Connecticut or the scale of the Nile, requires tremendous amounts of coordination, and I'll just sort of leave you with that, that basically effective river basin management requires coordinated effort across political and social boundaries, and this is certainly some of the things that Min's been talking about since he's been here, but also with the Nile River Project, communication is key, and that key might be music. Thank you. Oh, yeah, I don't know how to do it.
It's stuck up here. Can I just launch over top of that?
the green one. Yeah. Yeah. You can do that. Okay. Okay, I'm just going to very quickly go back to the global view and give you just a brief account of another basin where similar processes are playing out. But as Frank mentioned, over 50,000 large dams globally. They've had a very significant ecological, social impact. Of almost 500 million, 472 million people have been adversely affected by dams. As a result of that, partially a result of the concern over ecological and social impacts, we saw a global downturn in dam building and investment leading up to 2000, and then we're experiencing an uptick in global dam building. There's a geography to this, and most of this dam building is happening in the global south, Africa, Asia, Latin America. And the reason is because like this, the planned Grand Inga Dam on the Congo is because there's this idea that dams will bring development, industrialization, hydroelectricity will support regional development. The World Bank is now back as a supporter of large dams. They kind of pulled back leading up to that time, nearly 2000. You can see this article suggests that it's sort of a negative thing, big bad dams, the World Bank is back. Others see this as a positive trend. International Commission on Large Dams says, talking to Jim Kim, we're glad you're back. we're impressed and, heartened by these opportunities. The fact is that unlike maybe many decades ago, whenever you have a large dam planned, like this dam on the Omo River in Ethiopia, there's optimism about the development that dam might bring, but there's always the other side of the story. What is this going to do to Lake Turkana? What is it going to do to the cultures, to the ecosystem? Whether it's in Africa or Asia, you see these same tensions playing out. So dams planned for the Brahmaputra River, you can see it's going to bring needed electricity, but there are concerns about how is this going to impact the ecosystem or cultures. Climate change comes into play here as well because the Brahmaputra is one of those rivers that originates on the plateau of Tibet and is fed by glacial melt. Latin America is also another area of intense dam building. More than 20 large dams planned for the Amazon by 2020, 60 total. These do not go unprotested. Belamonte Dam will displace or adversely impact 15,000 indigenous people, throwing into question ideas about or definitions of development. It's not just the World Bank that is involved in supporting dams again, so there are new global actors. China is the most significant one. Chinese hydropower companies and banks, largest dam builders in the world now. As you can see, they're involved in the Mekong in a pretty dramatic way, but also 2 dams in the Nile are being supported by China. You can talk later if you want about how that changes, what goes on around dam building. And I just want to give you a very brief example of the Mekong because it's a basin that shares some similarities with the Nile in terms of the tensions around dam building. But also it's quite different in some ways. So 4,000-kilometer long river begins up in the plateau of Tibet, flows through Yunnan province in China, down through that border area of Laos, Thailand, Burma, Myanmar, and forms a border between Laos and Thailand, flows down through Cambodia and Vietnam. It is the focus of some pretty incredible plans in terms of dam building on the mainstream and tributaries. More than 100 dams are planned. And this is just the lower Mekong. And the upper Mekong in China, you can see the Yangtze, the Salween, the Mekong, plans for cascades of dams up there. There's already 7 large dams on the upper reaches of the Mekong. Why is China building these dams? Well, the idea is that this is for economic development and specifically for regional development. So this will be part of a regional energy grid that will benefit everybody downstream as well. And these cascade of dams will operate, in concert with one another. And China says, that this is going to make the flow of the Mekong more reliable for downstream countries. The problem is that the Mekong is actually a flood pulse-driven river, and it's sort of like the Blue Nile. It has a very predictable annual flood pulse, and far from it being beneficial to have that flood pulse ironed out, that pulse is actually the lifeblood of the Mekong. 1,700 species of fish that you find in this river. 90% of them spawn in floodplains and tributaries. You can see flood recession agriculture all along the banks of the Mekong. All of these, the nutrients that get deposited on the landscape, this is all bound up with the flood pulse. So to reduce that variability is really to kill the lifeblood of the Mekong, and there are tens of millions of people who depend upon those fisheries and those landscapes for their livelihoods. Most concern now are some of the mainstream dams that are going in on the lower Mekong. The Zaiburi Dam is the one that's causing the most controversy right now. Most independent, just about every single independent assessment says that this is going to do irreparable harm to the fisheries of the Mekong and to local populations. It's being protested. This is creating lots of tension between states in the basin. Laos is historically a weaker country, and now with its dam building, it's in interesting ways becoming more powerful. Again, unlike the Nile, the most powerful riparian in this basin is actually the uppermost one, China. But Laos is shifting the politics a little bit here. Laos is also building the Dong Sahong Dam, supported by Malaysian investors in this case. Another one which has people very worried. It's going to be built in the area where Kone Falls is, in the southern part of Laos, a couple kilometers up from the Cambodian border. This is an incredibly important area for fish to spawn and migrate through. The area itself is an important fishing ground. If this dam gets built, most people say the Irrawaddy dolphin, about 100 of them are left, freshwater dolphin will go extinct. So these mainstream dams are something new on the Mekong. The other ecosystem that is going to be impacted very dramatically is the Tonle Sap ecosystem in Cambodia. So I don't know if you remember Frank's slide showing that Egypt gets 97% of its water from outside its borders. Well, Cambodia gets something like 80-some-odd% of its waters from outside its borders. So the flood pulse, what the flood pulse means every year for Tonle Sap, the Great Lake, is that the Mekong reverses its flow and floods this landscape 3 to 5 times its dry season size, creating an incredibly productive fisheries. The Mekong produces 2 million tons of wild capture fisheries every year, 3.9 million tons of fish altogether, creates an incredibly fertile landscape upon which millions of people are dependent in Cambodia. And again, Cambodia is the country that is really most exposed in terms of these dams. A very poor country, more than 1 million people may lose their livelihoods. Moving down to the Mekong Delta, this is another area of concern. Vietnam grows 50% of its rice in this delta. It is one that depends on the flood pulse to deliver nutrients, to grow the delta, to prevent saltwater intrusion, to keep the soils from drying out as very acidic soils, and evening out the flow through these hydropower dams and through storing water in reservoirs is not actually something that would benefit this delta. So unlike the Nile, most of this water is not being held back for irrigation. It's being held back to create a more predictable flow for hydropower generation. So there are lots of ways in which this is, I think, maybe very similar to what's going on in the Nile in terms of the tensions that are created between riparians, but also, the ways it's very interestingly different in terms of just the hydrology. This is a relatively water abundant region, and in terms of the relative political economic might of the riparians. So I just wanted to end on saying that observers of the Mekong are kind of discouraged. Most people are quite discouraged by what we see in that what's going on there, because it seems like it's headed in the direction of some very, very problematic ecological, cultural harm. But that's not the whole story of rivers globally right now, in the United States or elsewhere. And this relates to another research project I'm working on. But as Frank, I don't know if he mentioned the figure, but we've removed more than 1,000 dams in the United States over the past couple decades. And what's interesting to me is the way that dam removal, river restoration is similar to what's going on in the Nile, also bound up with cultural restoration or revitalization. So in 1979, the Lower Elwha Cle tribe actually proposed removing the Elwha dams to regain their connection to the river and to fisheries. Both those dams came out, last one came out last summer. In Michigan, the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians is pioneering historic removal of 3 dams on the Boardman River, one of the largest river restoration projects in the Great Lakes. So reconnecting to rivers, which have cultural, spiritual importance, but also then restoring those rivers. In New Zealand, Waikato Tanui, an iwi, or a tribe, a Maori tribe, is undertaking a massive restoration of the Waikato River. And it's about river restoration, but it's also about cultural revival. And the river is their ancestor. And so they say that if the river is sick, we are sick. And they see this restoration as benefiting not just the Maori, but all New Zealanders. So again, going back to that idea of culture and rivers and restorations, I think it's really important to consider the way that culture, can be brought to, or cultural connections can be brought to river restoration. And not only is it just something you can add on, but maybe it's really essential for these sorts of endeavors. So, thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for these really engaging presentations. I just discovered that it's so convenient to have scientists speak before I do and allow me to speak more about music than philosophize about things I don't really know about. It's been really a learning process for an ethnomusicologist to understand a river with the complexity of the Nile. And I've really enjoyed your presentations. I've learned a lot of new things today. So I remember, it just reminds me that I was in Oregon State University last summer, and we were visiting the Columbia River, and we were talking about water issues and integrated water resource management, and people were looking at me all the time because I'm coming from San Francisco. Oh, California, you guys are so screwed. Like, we're so much better than you do. And then I'm thinking, the Nile, oh my God, this is so complex. And where do you start when you have such a complex water situation, a river that connects 11 countries, 9 out of which are among the 50 poorest countries in the world, and 437 million total population that is about to double in the next 30 years. And we haven't even started yet talking about all of the issues that we're facing. So when we started the project, we had no idea the situation was so gloomy, and maybe that's why we had a lot of hope, and we still do have a lot of hope. But we started the project from a place of musical curiosity. My co-founder, Maklit Hadero, and I both live in San Francisco. She's Ethiopian, I'm Egyptian, and it started from the realization that we really don't get exposed to each other's musical traditions and cultures where we come from. We get exposed to them in San Francisco, where we live, because there is the space that allows for Ethiopians and Egyptians to live together. I grew up in Cairo, Egypt, and I never heard of Ethiopian music growing up there. And for me, that was the initiative that started this whole project. And I could only list maybe 3 of these countries when I started the project 3.5 years ago. I went to undergrad, grad school, and I knew very little about the river I grew up by. So I started using myself as the most common denominator baseline for how citizens in the Nile Basin are engaged in their respective water resource management. And the music really has proven over the last 3 years that it can drive people's curiosity. It can drive people's curiosity about each other, and from there, there is understanding, and from there is empathy, and from there, people start questioning the water situation a little bit more than what they read in the news. So for us, the music was really kind of an engine of that curiosity, getting people to start asking questions. And then the conversations that ensue are really incredible because it's not just about water. It turns out it's all about race, it's all about African identity, it's all about the history of colonialism in these countries, it's all about slavery, it's all about current human rights for refugees from different countries that are living in other countries and how they're being treated when they're waiting on UNHCR to send them to another country. It's turned out to be a lot about human beings and much less about the water situation. And the music was just opening this incredible can of worms for us. So I'm not going to speak so much about a lot of the information that we went through, but the Nile Flow is clearly shows how 85% of the water of the Nile that goes through Egypt is coming from the Blue Nile that originates in Ethiopia, while 15% is coming from the White Nile. And this just gives you a little bit of an elevation point of view of the Blue Nile and the White Nile. The Blue Nile starts in Lake Tana in Ethiopia, which is even higher than where the White Nile starts. You can see, if you superimpose the flow over this elevation, you can imagine the flood that flood pulse that happens every year that has gone through Ethiopia into Sudan and Egypt and has really, through the silt, facilitated the civilization that took place in Egypt thousands of years ago, that has been really affected by the construction of the Aswan Dam and will definitely be affected by the construction of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam that's about 40% built at this point. Egyptians and Sudanese were concerned about Ethiopia's capacity of using this water that will be in the reservoir behind the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. You can see where the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, and you can ask the question, how are these Ethiopians going to bring the water back up to all of these other regions? And that's an interesting question that a lot of people are wondering about. I'll let our scientists discuss that after we finish this presentation. But this just also gives you a little bit of a worldview of where the Nile sits. It's the longest river in the world. It connects 11 countries, but it has much less water than most of the other rivers of its size. It has about 13% of the annual flow of the Amazon. So we're talking about a river that's really long and really skinny, which creates a very interesting scenario of water quantity disparity. When we were talking about Egypt having 97% of its water from the Nile originating elsewhere. Egypt and Sudan, some of the most water-scarce countries in the world, and Ethiopia having so much water but with very extreme rhythm, and many of these sub-Saharan African countries that have a lot of water but very low capacity to use this water becomes the question: how do you really regulate this relationship among all of these different countries that have very different development priorities? This infographic gives you an idea of that diversity, the environmental and economic diversity that these different countries are dealing with. You can barely see the water in Egypt, and look at the Congo. It's really hard to draw this infographic. But also look at the electricity. Even though Egypt has very little water, it has almost 100% energy penetration. And when Ethiopia is concerned about its energy, 23% energy penetration in Ethiopia. So it is really valid to be wanting to build a dam on the Blue Nile and to harness the power of this water. But how does this water affect its downstream countries is a question that requires that integrated resource management. And the hydropolitics become really complex. So we asked ourselves, do we actually have anything in common? And a lot of people ask us, do you think there's any commonality among all of these different countries. Again, we're talking about countries that exist in very different regions of Africa. And the world has not taught us to think of the Nile Basin as a region. The world has taught us to think of all of these different countries existing in completely different worlds. Egypt is part of the Middle East. Some people think it's part of Europe. And we all learned about Egypt in Western civilization, right? And most people don't really know where to situate Sudan. I personally don't know if Sudan is part of the Arab world, of sub-Saharan Africa, both. And then you have East Africa that does not really include Egypt, even though Egypt, to me, looks as east as many of these other countries. So when we started the project, we were really, by just looking at this bioregion, we were almost redrawing the geography of all of these different people. And this paradigm shift for us is a really powerful one, because we're looking at this watershed as a valid, not just environmental lens on the world, but a valid economical and human lens on the connections that have happened culturally for thousands of years before we even invented these countries. So when we go back to the slide with the musical instruments that we discovered exist everywhere along this river and nowhere east or west of this river, we started discovering that we actually do have a lot in common. So it became a very interesting ethnomusicological endeavor to start seeing how this river has facilitated the flow of culture. And there is not one single ethnomusicologist in the world that has looked at the connections among these Nile countries. So it's fascinating that we don't see this connection until we start looking for it. And why did we start looking for it? Because there was a conflict, and because we were curious about each other, we realized that there was a need to start looking at the connection that we have. So one other interesting example for us was the discovery of the connection between the adungu, which is a Ugandan instrument. If you come to our concert on Friday night at 8 p.m. at the Hop, you'll see Michael Bazibu, our Ugandan musician who plays like 50 instruments. But he plays mainly the adungu, and he's going to be playing it on Friday. And when we saw the adungu, it reminded us of these murals that we've grown up seeing in Egypt. And it was really interesting to have this Ugandan musician in Egypt, in Aswan, in 2013, play this instrument, tune it to Egyptian music, and play with our Egyptian singer on many of her songs. And the Egyptians were just totally confused at this point. It's like, I've only seen this instrument on ancient Egyptian walls. I remember our sound engineer told me, this is the real Egyptian music. It's not the other stuff that was imported after that from the Arabs and all the other cultures. Probably all of it is as Egyptian at this point. But it was just fascinating, people rediscovering these connections and how much it was affecting their self-perception and their identity and their lineage, and how much they are realizing how connected they are to each other. So for us, the music is really a driver of that conversation, a driver of that sense of curiosity, learning about how much we share that we don't see because the world has not taught us to think that way. And once you establish that sense of community, then you can have a conversation, a productive conversation around water issues that is not going to degenerate into whose water it is, because actually it's nobody's water. It just happens to be flowing through all of this land, and we just ended up associating ourselves with this land. So how do you really figure out a solution? It has to come from a place of sense of community, a place where all of these people are coming up with a paradigm that is mutually beneficial for everyone. And that's the kind of collaboration that we're looking to have in the Nile project, and not to just continue just making music, but use this music to change the way we collaborate across these countries. Can we get university students from all of these different countries to start thinking of collaboration models in other sectors, not the arts? I'm talking about agriculture or business or trade, that would allow us to come up with an arrangement that wouldn't have happened, that wouldn't have made the Nile project, the Nile sustainable, if we had just done this work locally. and that's the work that we're trying to do in the Nile project. So with this, I'm just going to end because I'm really interested in the conversation that's going to follow. And thank you for having us.
All right, well, we're really interested in hearing your questions. So feel free to raise your hand. I'll recognize you. And I might repeat your question if you say it softly enough. And then if you have a specific panelist that you'd like to respond to the question, please indicate that in your question. That one works. Yes.
There are interesting examples of end members on the continuum of water management right here in our backyard. And one of them is Hydro-Quebec, which spawned Northern Pass, and the other, Andy, is familiar with the restoration of the Penobscot River. I'm just wondering if the panelists can comment in any way on the incentives or the disincentives that have resulted in those two projects.
Who wants to take that one?
Let's see. So Hydro-Quebec and Northern Pass, I don't know about the incentives that have instigated it in its creation of the facilities in Quebec, but you have policy throughout New England where the states have said, we want renewable energy. Renewable energy is defined as many things, including hydropower. And very recently, the states have said, we have set goals for establishing renewable energy. And guess what? We may not be meeting those goals. And when we don't meet those goals, we have told ourselves that we would penalize ourselves financially. And Connecticut was a state that was reaching the point of having to penalize itself. And the governor said, I don't really want to do that to electricity rates. So I am very interested in bringing in Hydro-Quebec. So one of the policy conversations that's happened that has encouraged transmission projects like Northern Pass is to say that energy is tier 1 or grade A or gold star renewable energy, and we're going to bring more of it into New England in order to meet our self-imposed goals and get ourselves out of this box of not having to penalize ourselves by raising electricity rates. And that's a very important driver for Eversource and the people that are instigating Northern Pass. But there may be other.
I would say one of the things that is similar for both those cases is that you're dealing with tribal cultures. And so one of the big stumbling blocks for Hydro-Quebec was dealing with the way that indigenous people and cultures had been neglected during the planning stages as part of that. And also one of the key things for the Penobscot was the Penobscot tribe getting very involved with trying to remove the Great Works and VZ dams on the Penobscot. And so they might be separated by country, they might be separated by basin, but I think one of the big links is what Colleen was just talking about in terms of respect for indigenous cultures. And I think that's a big part of both of those projects.
Have the Native Americans gotten, or the natives gotten satisfaction out of Hydro-Quebec?
Yes.
They have. So I haven't heard that.
Yeah, I think if you look at Vermont, an example of how the indigenous tribes in Canada felt that they cut a good enough deal. So Vermont brings in a lot of Hydro-Quebec power, and they had this conversation. Is this renewable energy that has equity and the right values on it? And the indigenous tribes came down and met with the Vermont legislator and the policymakers and said, look, we've cut the best deal possible. We feel like we've been given a settlement that mitigates the impacts, and we're good with this. And then Vermont said, all right, well, there are compromises in all energy sources, so we're willing to sign contracts for Hydro-Quebec. And you know what? Energy's pretty cheap in Vermont. They're sitting pretty because of what they have done in bringing in Hydro-Quebec.
Yeah. Recently, I actually went to another panel that has a science and art, which was really interesting, and I'm really glad to hear some music here. And I wonder how you use the music as a language to kind of explore some of the themes related to Nile.
That's a great question. So I think we have this, for us, we started from the point of view of what is the context of the conflict. The context of the conflict is that in the history of the Nile Basin, all the upstream countries have considered Egypt to be the hydrohegemon, the power in the north that is really controlling the conversation around the water, not just the cultural imagination of the Nile. And very much similar to China, only it doesn't have all the water upstream. And we wanted to create a new paradigm that would allow all of these different parties to feel included. So we started looking at how our ecosystem has organized itself and distill that into principles that we can translate into music. And one of those principles for us was participatory leadership. How can we bring musicians from different parts of the Nile Basin and in this collective make music that represents everyone and that does not make one musician higher or lower than others? So we brought 18 musicians together in the first year, and we experimented with this idea. Our musical director, Miles J., and myself were managing this collaboration. In the first few days, we had workshops where they all taught each other their musical traditions so that everyone understood where everyone else was coming from. But we started this musical speed dating on the first day. So we split the 18 musicians into pairs, and we just gave them an hour to go somewhere. We were in this beautiful property on the Nile, and we gave them an hour to just go learn about each other musically. Some of them were jamming, some of them were talking, some of them were teaching each other some things. And then after an hour, we switched them, and then we switched them again. So every person had met 3 people on the first day. And then the second day, we asked them to pick 2 musicians to make trios. So we had 6 trios for an hour, working on 6 songs. And then the second hour, we switched them again. And then the third hour, we switched them again. So we had 18 songs in 3 hours. And every person that was participating in 3 songs didn't know what else was happening elsewhere. And every person had a song. Or a piece of music, a composition. So every person felt like their musical vision was being manifested with the support of other musicians that they chose. During the first half, the rest of the time, we allowed them to grow those trios into quartets and quintets. So every piece of music was gaining a little bit more momentum. And then we had an open mic in the middle of the residency where we allowed everyone to play for each other. We had like about 5 hours worth of music. And we sat down, 18 of us, and we decided we're gonna put this 5 hour into a 2 hour set. So everyone collectively decided what pieces to take out, what pieces to slim down. And we organized this music. It was kind of like putting the puzzle in the middle of the room and trying to organize it into something that is coherent and makes sense. And in 2 weeks, we performed our first concert and recorded that first concert, and that was our first album. All of us had no idea what this music was going to sound like. But what was really important and what really came across when we performed was the relationships among these musicians. On stage, it looked like a musical roulette where the leader was always rotating, and no one felt like they were responsible for the total outcome, but they were supporting others, and at some point they were stepping into it. And I think that created a dynamic among the musicians that we felt was a model for the way we can solve other problems outside of music. If we brought all of these different people, if the politicians in the Nile Basin started doing this, maybe there will be some creative solutions. I'm not talking about, it was just the creativity that comes from this setup is incredible. And that's I think what we need in terms of cooperation, turning conflict into cooperation, you need creative solutions. You need something that we don't see together except when we sit together. So how do you harness that collective intelligence in the group, especially if you're bringing a group of very multidisciplinary or different disciplines that really need translation and really need to understand each other. So for us, it's work like that really models the kinds of relationships and the kinds of collaborations we'd like to see in the Nile Basin.
Following up on that, I've been involved in just way too many agency meetings where the public is brought in to weigh in on issues like the relicensing. So I just wonder if there's some way that you get FERC to do something like Nina's suggesting there, something creative that is going to kind of break through their kind of barrier that they set up and the kind of culture that they have as an agency? Is there something, Andy, that you could see that you've done there?
So what can you learn from Nina?
Well, we can give all of the state commissioners liars and do some musical speed dating. I think that what we're hoping is if we can collect these 1,000 river stories, and we will have exhibitions, if that can bring state and FERC together and we can do events around the installation of these 1,000 river stories, maybe we can get them to, take a little bit of a jolt and figure out a conversation. Because frankly, the best results in these types of processes come out of settlement. And maybe this will provide a space where there can be settlement negotiations and not a lot of paper tossed to Washington and a draft license coming back. But it's tough. I don't know that we have something as evocative or as inspiring as the Nile Project, but you're exactly right. It's pretty typical, and it doesn't give the public a lot of assurances or levers.
We're happy to bring liars anytime.